Buildings can indeed be rebuilt, stairs relaid, and doorways bricked up to reduce them to the necessary size. But what about objects that cannot be changed? There are artifacts that break any attempt to explain their existence from the point of view of the anthropometry of an ordinary person. In museums and private collections around the world, there are things that a person of our height physically could not use, and these objects are neither symbolic nor ritualistic. Take, for example, ancient folios. We are not talking simply about big books, but about giant tomes weighing up to 40 to 50 kilograms, with a binding height exceeding a meter. The official version states that this was done for solemnity or to fit more text, but try to imagine the process of reading such a book. For an ordinary person to turn one page, they need to stand up, use both hands, and exert significant physical effort. Reading such a text while sitting at a table is impossible. The letters are huge, and the human field of vision does not cover the page entirely. But for a creature 3 to 4 meters tall, such a book would be equivalent to our standard A4 format. The font, line spacing, paper thickness, everything is calculated for giant hands and eyes located at a completely different height. An even more graphic example is weapons. Museums display two-handed swords, zweihanders and claymores, whose length exceeds 2 meters and whose weight is such that only a trained athlete can lift them, and then only for a short time. To speak of fencing with such monsters in real combat is ridiculous. The inertia of such a blade would make its owner easy prey after the very first swing. Historians claim these are ceremonial weapons. But many blades have notches, traces of blows, and resharpening, indicating that they were actively used in battles. By whom? By a man who would get tired just holding it up? Or by a warrior for whom this sword was a standard lightsaber? The same applies to firearms. Giant muskets, which are today called wall guns, have stocks that are impossible for an ordinary person to brace against their shoulder. The trigger is too far away. We are told that they were operated by crews of 2 people. But the design of the stock clearly points to individual use by a creature with long arms and broad shoulders. Let's not forget musical instruments. Huge double basses and cellos preserved from those times require a musician to have superhuman fingerspans and arm lengths. For an ordinary virtuoso to play a full piece on them is extremely difficult, if not impossible. All these objects, books, swords, guns, instruments, were created with perfect ergonomics in mind, but the ergonomics of a species, not our own. This is not symbolism or hyperbole. These are the everyday items of real giants who once held them in their hands, just as naturally as we hold smartphones. And if the material evidence is so obvious in Europe, it is logical to assume that traces of this race must be recorded in other corners of the planet. If the geographical scope of artifacts seems limited, one only needs to broaden the horizons and look at the heritage of other great civilizations to understand. Giants were a global phenomenon that knew no borders. Traces of their presence stretch across continents and millennia, from the sands of ancient Egypt to the Gothic vaults of medieval Europe, forming a single stone chronicle that we stubbornly refuse to read literally. Ancient Egypt provides perhaps the most extensive and vivid material. The walls of temples and tombs are covered with bas-reliefs and frescoes where the same plot repeats with frightening regularity. Figures of enormous height stand next to people who barely reach their knees. Official Egyptology has fed us a convenient explanation for decades, calling this hierarchical perspective. Scholars claim that the size of the figure in the drawing depended exclusively on social status. The pharaoh was depicted as a giant because he was godlike, and his servants and enemies as small to emphasize their insignificance. But if we discard this imposed dogma and assume that ancient artists, who possessed incredible skill in anatomy and architecture, simply recorded reality, everything falls into place. This is not an allegory of power, but a documentary depiction of biological difference. We see not metaphorical giants, but real rulers towering over their subjects in the literal sense of the word. Similar evidence can be found in the heart of Europe, in the sculptural compositions of ancient cathedrals. Look closely at the statues of knights and saints adorning the facades and interiors of temples. Often, next to these majestic figures, animals are depicted: lions, bulls, or war horses. But their proportions cause bewilderment. A fearsome lion next to a warrior looks no bigger than a lapdog, barely reaching the knee. And a riding horse seems like a pony whose back is at the waist level of the person standing next to it. Art historians rush again to explain this as an inability to observe proportions, or the symbolic meaning of the victory of spirit over flesh. However, common sense suggests that sculptors capable of carving the finest lace from stone and conveying emotions on a face were unlikely to be massively mistaken in the size of a horse. It is much more likely that the animals were of ordinary size, but the people standing next to them were true giants. Too many coincidences are scattered around the world to consider this an accident, or the collective fantasy of artists from different eras and cultures. Statues of Buddha, antique colossi, Egyptian bas-reliefs, and medieval engravings, they all speak the same language, the language of gigantism. They try to explain to us that in the past, people thought exclusively in symbols, ignoring reality. But perhaps there is much more common sense in ancient art than in modern history textbooks. Everyday objects, architecture, and images fit together into a single puzzle, proving that a race surpassing us in all parameters once existed on Earth. However, if the evidence of their existence is so obvious and tangible, the most important and disturbing question arises, one that gives researchers no peace. Where did this powerful civilization disappear to? What could wipe off the face of the earth beings possessing such strength and technology? And are they really gone forever? Or does a particle of their heritage, their blood and genetic code continue to live in us, reminding us of itself from time to time with unexpected manifestations? Even if stone can be destroyed by time or rehewn by new masters, biology is much harder to deceive. Nature possesses the amazing property of preserving information through generations, and what we are used to considering anomalies may actually be the key to solving the riddle of our true origins. Looking at archival photographs from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we often stumble upon images of people of phenomenal height. Official medicine hastily hangs the label gigantism or acromegaly on them, attributing everything to hormonal failures and diseases. However, upon close examination, many of these patients look like absolutely healthy, proportionally built, and physically strong people, devoid of the bone deformities characteristic of the disease. This suggests that before us is not a mistake of nature, but a manifestation of powerful genetic memory, a sudden awakening of an ancient recessive gene. Perhaps chains inherited from those very titans who built antique cities and posed for Italian artists still slumber in our DNA. From time to time, nature glitches in the program of shrinking humanity, and people are born into the world bearing the physical appearance of our distant ancestors or predecessors. We live in an era of genetic oblivion, but the blood remembers what was crossed out of history textbooks. The very fact of the appearance of such people in our time serves as living proof that the giant civilization did not vanish without a trace, but dissolved into us, mixing with the more compact species of survivors. But why did we survive? This question inevitably leads us to the topic of a global catastrophe or war that put an end to the era of giants. All that remains of them are first floors buried in mud, orphaned megalithic structures, and scraps of legends. Where did they go? Most likely, the answer lies not in secret Antarctic bases, but in the relentless work of time and those who rewrote history. We live on ruins that we claimed for ourselves, convincing ourselves of our own greatness. We look at giant arches and doors without noticing their true scale because we were taught not to ask unnecessary questions. Today, when we have access to archives and the ability to compare facts, we stand on the threshold of a grandiose realization. Giants are not a myth, not a fairy tale, and not an allegory. This is a real chapter of our past that was intentionally torn out of the book of existence. Denying this fact is profitable for those who want to preserve the illusion of linear progress, where modern man is the crown of creation. But one only needs to open one's eyes once, stop blindly believing textbooks, and trust what one sees with one's own eyes, and the old world collapses. We are not the only masters of this planet, and perhaps we never were. History is waiting to be rewritten anew, but this time, relying on the truth frozen in stone and in our own blood.